the untold story behind Minnesota's 1989 cold case breakthrough. On a brutally cold Minnesota morning in 1989, when the roads were silent and the snow-covered fields looked untouched by the world, a sheriff's deputy slowed his patrol car along a lonely county highway and noticed something dark and unnatural, lying in a shallow ditch beside the road, a discovery that would quietly ignite one of the most haunting and stubborn cold cases in the state's history. There were no flashing lights, no screaming witnesses, no dramatic chase scene, just a lifeless body, partially covered by snow, stripped of identity, stripped of answers, and surrounded by questions that would remain unanswered for decades. As investigators quickly realized that this was not a simple accident and not an obvious crime either, the victim was identified within days. A local adult with an ordinary routine, no criminal past, no known enemies, no threats, no signs that their life was spiraling toward violence, which initially gave detectives confidence that this case would be solved quickly, because most murders don't happen in total isolation. But almost immediately, things stopped making sense, because there was no wallet, no weapon, no sign of robbery, no defensive wounds that clearly pointed to a struggle, and no reliable witnesses who could place anyone suspicious near the scene, leaving investigators staring at evidence that seemed deliberately incomplete. The medical report only deepened the confusion, because the injuries didn't cleanly match a hit and run, didn't clearly suggest a shooting, and didn't fully support an accidental death either, creating a gray zone where every theory collapsed under scrutiny, forcing detectives to admit something deeply unsettling. Someone had gotten away with this. Weeks passed, interviews dried up, leads turned cold, and the investigation slowly lost momentum as new cases demanded attention. Budgets tightened, and the brutal reality set in that without new evidence or a confession, this case was going nowhere. Eventually, the file was boxed up, labeled, and shelved, joining hundreds of other unsolved cases, but one detail refused to disappear. A tiny inconsistency buried in the medical findings that one veteran detective kept circling back to, even though he couldn't explain it and didn't yet have the tools to prove it mattered. At the time, forensic science simply wasn't advanced enough to turn that detail into evidence. So the system did what it always does when it runs out of answers. It moved on. And the detective eventually retired, witnesses relocated or passed away, and the case faded into the background of Minnesota's unsolved history. Nearly 30 years later, a new generation of investigators began reopening old cases, driven by advances in DNA technology and a renewed belief that the past could still speak. And that's when a young cold case investigator opened a dusty box filled with yellowed photographs, brittle police reports, and sealed evidence bags older than her own career. As she reviewed the file, her eyes stopped on the same overlooked detail that had haunted investigators decades earlier. But this time, it didn't look insignificant, because science had finally caught up, and what once seemed meaningless now looked like a quiet scream hidden in plain sight. She submitted the preserved sample for modern DNA testing, fully aware that it was a long shot, but also knowing that cold cases don't survive on certainty. They survive on patience. And weeks later, the phone rang with the kind of call that changes everything. There was no direct match to a suspect, but there was something far more powerful, a familial DNA connection. Someone related to the source who had voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to a genealogy database, never imagining it would connect them to a murder committed decades earlier. Slowly, a family tree began to form, branches narrowing, names repeating, until one individual stood out, a person who had been questioned back in 1989, briefly considered, and then dismissed, someone who had lived freely for decades believing the case was buried forever. When investigators finally approached this person years later, they didn't rush, they didn't accuse, and they didn't bluff, because time had already done the work, and piece by piece they laid out the old evidence, the new science, the overlooked detail, and the DNA connection that tied everything together. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that fills a room when denial no longer works. And although the suspect tried to minimize their actions, tried to reshape the past, the truth was already frozen in place, preserved by evidence and unlocked by technology. The arrest didn't feel triumphant, because justice delayed is never clean, and for the victim's family, there were no cheers or relief, only a quiet, painful sense of closure that came far too late to heal the damage time had already done. This case became a powerful reminder that cold cases are not dead. They are simply waiting for science to evolve, waiting for the right person to look again, waiting for time itself to turn against those who believe they've escaped the past. Because no matter how carefully a crime is hidden, no matter how long it stays buried under snow, paperwork, and silence, the truth has a way of resurfacing, and when it does, it comes back stronger than ever. And somewhere right now, in a forgotten evidence room, there's another box, another overlooked detail, and another story quietly waiting for the moment when the ice finally melts.